Bienvenue, mes amis, and welcome to another episode of Bonjour and all that. Remember, this is the video series that the Spanish Club of Ukulele High School in Birdsnot, Kentucky does not want you to see. Today's lesson is all about relative pronouns in French. All right, well, that's an interesting topic, isn't it? And in today's lesson, I'm going to first tell you about relative pronouns in English and then present them to you in French. So we're going to have a little bit of English and a little bit of French all in one lesson. Sounds great, doesn't it? Okay, let's get started with it all. This is another bare bones guide. This time it's the bare bones guide to relative pronouns. All right, a relative pronoun connects a main clause, which introduces a noun, to a relative clause, which provides more information about this noun. All right, here's an example. I found the money that you lost. You see, we have our main clause, I found the money, and we have our relative clause, that you lost. Notice how the main clause introduces the noun money, but the relative clause tells us more information about that money. It tells us that it is the money that you lost. Okay? That's what relative pronouns do. The main clause is, like I said, I found the money. There we introduce the noun money. The relative clause, that you lost, gives us more info about the money. And the relative pronoun is the word that. It connects the two clauses to form one thought. Okay, the noun introduced in the main clause is also known as the antecedent. All right, because it comes before. That's what antecedent means, coming before. So it comes before the relative clause. In English, there are three main relative pronouns: that, which, and who. And did you know that there are rules for using these? There are. But before I get into the rules, just let me tell you, while there are rules as to which one you should use in certain circumstances, in English, that kind of rule is more like a speed limit. You know, people don't always obey the speed limits. Some people treat them more like suggestions, and that's how it is with relative pronouns. There are rules for which one you should use. However, people tend to ignore those rules and use the one they like instead. So, here we go. In English, you use the word that when the relative clause begins with a noun or pronoun. Here's an example. He doesn't like the car that his parents own. Okay, there the relative clause is his parents own, and it's introduced by the relative pronoun that, because his parents is a noun. All right, notice we have our main clause there. He doesn't like the car, so our antecedent is the car, and the relative clause gives us more information about that car. It tells us that it's the car his parents own. Okay, you're going to use which when the relative clause begins with a verb, and the antecedent is not a person. Here's an example. She bought a new car which has 6 cup holders. Okay, our main clause is she bought a new car, and our relative clause is has 6 cup holders. That relative clause tells us more about the antecedent or the car. It tells us that that car has 6 cup holders. All right, and we use the relative pronoun which because car, of course, is not a person. And notice that our relative clause begins with a verb has. So that's why we used which. Then you're supposed to use the relative pronoun who when the relative clause begins with a verb and the antecedent is a person. Here's an example. We met a salesperson who was quite aggressive. Okay, our main clause, we met a salesperson, introduces the noun salesperson, and our relative clause, was quite aggressive, tells us more about that salesperson. And we connect them with the relative pronoun who. Why? Because our antecedent, salesperson, is a person. All right? So that's how you're supposed to use them in English, but we all know that people will say, we met a salesperson that was quite aggressive. Sticking in that for who. And it just happens all the time. We're very, very lax with the rules on relative pronouns, and that's just how English rolls sometimes, you have to admit. Okay, so now that we've set up how to use relative pronouns in English, let's look at how they're used in French, because they're used in a very similar way. So if you understand this concept in English, you'll have no trouble understanding it in French. Okay, in French, there are also three main relative pronouns: que, qui, and dont. All right, let's take a look at que, qui, and dont. All right. You use que when the relative clause begins with a noun or pronoun. Here's my example. Elle a loué l'appartement que j'ai peint. All right. She rented the apartment that I painted. Notice that our main clause, elle a loué l'appartement, introduces the noun appartement. And our relative clause, j'ai peint, tells us more about the apartment. It tells us specifically which apartment, the one I painted. And because our relative clause, j'ai peint, begins with a pronoun, we're going to use que. Elle a loué l'appartement que j'ai peint. All right? You use qui when the relative clause begins with a verb. Here's an example. Nous cherchons une maison qui a 4 chambres. We are looking for a house which has 4 bedrooms. Okay, our main clause, nous cherchons une maison, introduces the noun une maison. All right, and then our relative clause, a 4 chambres, has 4 bedrooms, okay, tells us more information about that house. It tells us that it's a house that has 4 bedrooms. All right? Well, we connect nous cherchons une maison and a 4 chambres with the relative pronoun qui. All right? That's because our relative clause begins with a verb, the verb a. So, now you know how to use qui, que, you know how to use qui. All right? There's one other one that's a little different than some of the relative pronouns we have in English. This relative pronoun is dont. And you use dont when a relative clause ends in a verb that requires the preposition de. All right? Now, you don't run into this a whole lot, but you do run into it. And when you do, you need to know how to use this relative pronoun dont. Here's my example. Ma sœur est la femme dont tu parles. My sister is the woman of which you are speaking. In French, you cannot end a sentence with a preposition. In English, we do it all the time. In English, I could say, my sister is the woman you are speaking of. And that's fine, and everybody gets it. But that sentence ends with a preposition. In French, I can't say, ma sœur est la femme que tu parles de. Because I can't end the sentence with de. So instead, I'm going to use the relative pronoun dont, which means of which. So when I say that, it's translated more accurately as, my sister is the woman of which you are speaking. Ma sœur est la femme dont tu parles. So that's an interesting twist on relative pronouns. Not one we have in English. I guess it's available to say of which. It's just not something we do very often. All right. Well, now you know about relative pronouns. They connect main clauses with relative clauses. The relative clauses give us more information about the noun in the main clause. And that noun in the main clause has a special name. It's called the antecedent. All right. So, great lesson. Not very complicated, but very, very important if you want to provide sentences which provide good information to the listener or to the reader. So, I hope you've got it. I hope you practice it. I hope you enjoy relative pronouns. And you know, I'll be back later with another lesson in French, but for now, it's time for me to say à bientôt, mes amis.